Hi everyone, welcome to Your Techie Buddy. So this is our continuation of our Java 8 interview question series. Today the topic is optional class. So let's get started. So what is optional? So Java introduced a new class called optional in Java 8 version. So the class signature is like this. It's a final class and it extends the object class. So why was this class introduced? It is a public final class and it is used to deal with null pointer exception in a Java application. To deal any kind of null pointer exception which we think we could get, right? In those cases, we go for optional. So optional is a container object which may or may not contain a null value. So you can imagine option is a class, right? So you can imagine optional as a container, right? So suppose I have a string, it has a value. Suppose if I have declared that as optional, what will happen? If that has a value, it will be stored in this container. If the string is null, that means there is no value. Instead of null, it will still be an optional object, but it will be empty. So what it is? So imagine this container is an optional, right? So this can have a value which is in this case s, or it will not have a value. That means it will be an empty container. So when do we get a null pointer exception? Whenever we invoke a method on something which is null, right? We get that null pointer exception. But imagine if this is not null. So optional solves that problem. If you declare the type of this as optional, it will never be null. It will always be empty. So an empty dot something you are calling. So you will not get a null pointer exception. If it is a value, if it is having a value, it is very good. Value dot that method. So this will not fail. Neither the condition where it is not having a value dot that method will not fail. So optional is a container object which may or may not contain a non-null value. So it will either have a value that is a non-null value or it will be empty, right? So if a value is present, there is a if is present method which will return true, and get will return the value. So whenever you declare an object as optional, first you will check whether if you get a value from it or not. If it is present, then only we'll get the value. The method get is used to get the value. By using optional, we can specify the alternate values to return or alternate code to run. So not only can you check if it is present and then you can get the value, there are many other methods also, like if it is present, what next we want it to do. So now let's get to into an example here. I'll take a string array of names and I'll just initialize the array. Okay, I'll just initialize this to suppose 10. Now what I'm doing is I'll take another string and I'll try to extract one name from this array. Suppose the name at as the second position dot. I'm trying to invoke a method here. Suppose to uppercase. I'll do it as to uppercase. Okay. Now I'll try to print this name. So what do you think what will happen? For sure we'll get a null pointer exception, right? Yes. Why? Because at this point we've initialized the names, but we have not assigned any value. And here I'm trying to invoke a method on a null value, right? This is what I'm doing. On a null value, I'm trying to call a method, invoking a method on a null value. So that is why we are getting a null pointer exception. So how do we solve this? So what is the problem here? The problem here is this one, right? This is the null value. This is the problem. So what we'll do is we'll declare something called optional and we'll keep the type here as string. Now uh, we'll say optional is equal to optional dot of nullable. Then we'll put the problematic thing inside that, right? Names of two. That's it. Instead of directly putting it to a string and expecting something, what we'll do it, we'll make it as optional. That means it is optional. We are not sure. Let me name this as name. So we are not sure if any value will come or not. That's why we made it optional dot of nullable of this, right? Now when I do this is out of name, we'll see what happens. So it returns an optional object to me, dot empty. Why? Because we know this doesn't have a value. Now instead of throwing a null pointer exception, it is giving me optional dot empty, which is nothing but an object like this, right? An empty optional object which is having nothing. That's why optional dot empty. But suppose if I would have done names of 2 is equal to your techie buddy. Okay, now I've assigned something, right? Assigned something means inside this I have put some value, right? Your techie buddy I've put inside this. Now when I'll try to run this, it will give me optional object, but what does it contain? Your techie buddy. So in both the case, either I initialize it, either give certain value to it, or I don't give certain value. In both of the cases, I'm not getting a null pointer exception, right? So this is what optional is. Now what I'm doing here is, okay, before that I'll show you what is this off nullable. So what this off nullable, so this is an interview question. They ask you what is optional, what is the difference between optional dot off and optional dot off nullable. So when you do optional dot off nullable, right? So in this case, we know that this might contain a null value, right? Here I have not put anything, that means it's a null value. But still it is working fine for me. It doesn't throw any exception, null pointer exception. But if suppose I would have done optional dot of names of 2. So this optional dot of is incapable of handling null values in this case. So if you run this, see, I got the null pointer exception. So go for optional dot of nullable when you think you can expect a null value here. That time you go for optional dot of null. It is preferred to use optional dot of nullable, right? Now I've done this. I put this value here. So what I'm doing is I was printing empty, right, before that. So what I'll do is once I get this name, once you get this option thing, what you will do this if so there is this name dot if present method, right? You have to check if present, and then you have to do system dot out dot println name. Name is here a optional, right? You want to print the value, so when you want to get the value, do get. So this is what we do. So if name dot is present, that means this optional object is having certain value is present, then only you get that value. So when we put this check there, we get nothing, right? For more clarification, else no value present. So when I run this, I'll get no value present, right? If I was having any value, then when I run this, it will check if it is present, then it will get the value. See, it is this get method is used to get the value of an optional object. Before, when this get was not there, we were getting the whole object, right? So optional object and then the Yotiki body, right? So one more thing I want to show you here is suppose I don't have any value and suppose I have not put this check if present, okay? And I'm just trying to sys out dot get, right? If I was not putting this get and I have a null value, it was working all fine, right? It was not giving me null pointer exception at least, but it was printing an empty optional. But now when I'm doing here name dot get, it will give me null pointer exception, no such element exception because no value is present. We are trying to do a get from an option where we optional where we are having a null value or empty value. When you are doing an get on an empty optional, you will get this no such element exception. That's why whenever you do a get, you have to have this is present check. So that is the significance of is present check and get. So whenever you have this uh, optional object and you're trying to do a get, you should always do it in conjunction with is present. It is safe to do with is present, otherwise you might get this error, no value present. So let's go back to the slide. So if a value is present method will return true. As I said, it will return true, and get will return the value, right? So by using optional, you can specify alternate values to return to alternate code. So now the question arises, why do we need optional in Java? So the main purpose of optional is to be a return type of methods that previously would return null. Suppose you have so this is just for example's sake, right? I have done it here. Suppose you have a method. It was returning a value and you were trying to call that method here. And suppose that method was returning a null, right? In those cases, you have to deal with null pointer. You have to write, right, to check the null exception, null pointer exception and all. So in those cases, what you can do is for those methods, the return type you can declare as optional. The return type you can declare as optional. So when you try to get or access this method here, you can store that in an optional object. So such method would require us to write boilerplate code to check the return value, and we could sometimes forget to do a null check, right? So for if suppose optional was not there and this method was returning something and we were directly accessing this method in our main method and it was giving it might give a null, then we have to write here null checks again and again, right? We have to deal with it. As Java developer, we are very familiar with null pointer exception. It can crash our code, right? It is very difficult to avoid it without using too many null checks, right? If optional was not there, we would have written too many null checks. So to overcome this, Java 8 introduced this new class called optional. For instance, the stream.mean method calculates the minimum value in a stream of values, right? But what if the stream itself is empty? If it wasn't for optional, the method would return a null or throw an exception, right? So there are few methods in optional. Optional.off nullable is the method which I showed you, right? Method returns a non-empty optional if a value is present in the given object. Otherwise, it will return an empty optional. So here, when names is empty, it will return an empty optional. But if names was having a value here, then it would return that value. Then optional dot empty, this method is useful to create an empty when you want to create an empty optional object, you can use this method. Optional is present returns true if the given option object is non-empty, otherwise it returns false. Just now I showed you. Optional if present performs a given action if the okay, so this is equivalent to this third point. By using optional, we can specify alternate values to run or alternate code to run. So this is the method. Optional if present performs a given action if the given optional object is non-empty, otherwise it returns false. Optional dot or else it returns the value of if present in the optional container, otherwise it returns a given default value. So now let's check optional if present. Okay, what we'll do here is we'll do name is the optional object dot if present. If present, if you see, it takes a consumer. So okay, so if present name, what we'll do is we'll sys out this is the name. Okay, let me change the variable name, and this is the name. So what we are telling is if this optional object, if it present, then take this consumer. Consumer is nothing but it takes one input, right? It does nothing, it just consumes. So we are printing it out. So and now I will give this if present, we'll give a value here. Now when I run this, so this is the name, your techie buddy, right? So there's so this is if present. What if you want to do something if it is not present, right? If what if you want to do something if present you want to do certain thing, but if not present you want certain other things to be done, right? So in that case you can go for if present or else. So this it takes if you see consumer and runnable empty action. So if present we have already written what we want to do. So I'll just copy that consumer here, comma. If not, when there is nothing, what we want to do? S out. The name is not present, right? Now let's run this. it will print the first part, right? Because the name is present, your techie buddy is present. So this name is your techie buddy. Now when I comment this out and it is empty, it will take the or else part. If present or else. So if present was only letting us do when something was there, do something. But when something is not there, we still want some alternate things to be done, then we can write alternate code to be run, right? You can write that in if present or else. So this is the alternate code. So now it should call the name is not present, right? So this is how we do if present and if if present or else. So this is what you can do. So now the question arises, right? In the real time, you will never write something like this, right? You will initialize something and you'll not, you'll declare something and you'll not initialize it. It is null and you're trying to just directly access it. So this is not how things work, right? But from interview point of view, this much understanding is enough because they will ask you what is optional, if you know about optional or not, and what is it use. So it is optional is a class which was introduced in Java 8 to handle null pointer exception, right? And then they can ask you these important methods, optional dot off, how can you declare an optional? So optional dot off, optional dot nullable, off nullable, optional dot empty, right? And what is if present, what is present, and what is the drawback of get? Like why, how should you use a get? So you should always use a get in conjunction to if present, right? So all this from interview point of view, it is very important. This concept is very important. But in real time application, when as a as a Java developer we are working, as a backend developer we are working, we use optional when we deal with DAO objects. So if they ask you that where have you used optional in your project, you can tell in the DAO object, because in the database layer where we are trying to interact with the database and we are doing certain things like find by ID or find all, all such things, right? When we are trying to fetch something from the database, in that scenario we cannot be sure, right? It can return an empty object, it can return a null object. Suppose instead of this names dot to, suppose I was trying to fetch an employee detail from an employee table. Suppose I got that object, and based in that object I was trying to do certain operation. So what if this was my employee type, I would still get that null pointer exception, right? So in those cases what we do, we declare those return type as optional. It will give us optional, right? So instead of declaring as employee or any custom object for that matter, you can declare it as optional. So when you declare it as optional, you can handle all this null pointer exception. Otherwise, you have to write again and again all the null pointer check. So when they ask you where have you used optional in your project, you can clearly mention in the DAO layer or in the repository layer, the return type is optional, and in our, when we are trying to access in our business logic, we declare those as optional so that we can avoid this null pointer checks. So the last part, what are the advantages of optional? All these we checked. Null checks are not required or reduced, right? Too many null checks we have to do if optional was not there. So all that have reduced. No more null pointer exception and runtime. Our code will not abruptly end at the runtime, right? And makes the code more readable. That is true when so many LOC will reduce, right? It will be more readable. We can develop clean and neat APIs. Same thing. No more boilerplate code. No more boilerplate code in this sense. No, boilerplate code is something like same code, repetitive code again and again with very slight changes, right? So no more codes like that. So this was all about optional, very important topic from interview point of view. And yeah, in the next video, I'm going to cover streams. That would be the last part of my Java 8 series. So thank you so much. Please subscribe and like the video. Thank you.